Thank you, Eileen. I think you were stretching it out so I would make that 8:30 mark. I hope to be done earlier than that. I think I've got a little bit less to talk about this evening, but quite frankly, this is a presentation I've been looking forward to make for a long time, because I think when you're looking at the surrender between Lee and Grant and then the surrender ceremony itself, that is a very important piece of American history to understand. I think it's the most poignant moment in American history, of all of our history, and has an incredible impact on what's going to happen after the war. Unfortunately, it was followed by what I believe is the most tragic moment in American history, and that's obviously the assassination of President Lincoln. But that's to set up the stage here a little bit. I have two assistants with me this evening. I have Mark Floto, who started writing poetry that centered on the Civil War, and especially the letters of Civil War soldiers, quite some time ago, early in the whole process of doing this. I don't know to any extent that I was responsible for that, but I've been very impressed with Mark's poetry, and we're going to hear a little bit of it this evening, and you'll have a chance to see some of that poetry during the reception period as well. So we have an accomplished poet with this evening. We also have Christian McWhorter, who works with the Papers of Abraham Lincoln, but I believe for your dissertation, Christian, you wrote a book on the music of the Civil War, the hymns of the Civil War, and he'll be talking to us briefly about that aspect. So early in this presentation, while we're still in the trenches of Petersburg, we're going to be talking about the experiences of the Civil War soldier, which I think are quite universal. Doesn't matter much which side of the fighting you're on. And that's one of the things that especially strikes me about the Civil War. These soldiers on either side had so much in common. So much. And that's going to be illustrated in what they present and illustrated at the end of the presentation, I hope. I do want to mention a few other people who have really helped a lot in these presentations. I haven't been up here by myself. In the first one, on tactics and strategy, for those who are here, you'll remember Jim Leineke and Jim Patton dressed up in Civil War garb and talking about the weapons of the war, and that was a huge hit. I think it was the Fredericksburg presentation. Jack can probably correct me, but we had Jack Nevins talking about medicine and the impact of these horrendous injuries. We had Dr. Brian Andresen talking about the Emancipation Proclamation. We had Dr. James Cornelius talking about the election of 1864, and the last presentation for Petersburg, we had Robert Davis come and talk to us about the involvement in that battle of the U.S. colored troops. And you should have a flyer for the next two presentations. This is, when I initially planned this, we had 13. This is the last one, but we've squeezed in a couple more later in the year, in October. So I hope you come for those. But let's get moving. Well, that's a good start. Petersburg siege lines. For those of you who were here for the Petersburg presentation, this should look familiar. And what we basically have is Petersburg. As I mentioned last time, it's not technically a siege because they still are resupplied from the South Side Railroad. And these siege lines don't end right here. As you recall, they go across the Bermuda 100 right here, and they extend all the way up and wrap around Richmond, Virginia. So these are very extensive lines that the Confederates have to guard. And as we saw in the last presentation, Grant kept pushing the lines farther and farther west, and Lee kept stretching out his troops thinner and thinner as the war extended to the west. So that's where we start. Very quickly, the Union order of battle. And this is the first time that for order of battle that I didn't break it down by divisions. So you don't see the divisions. Most corps have 3 divisions each. In this case, we've got some new faces here in command. Lieutenant General Ulysses Grant, the only lieutenant general in the Army at the time, commanding the entire United States forces, not just here, but Sherman throughout the entire Western theater as well. The Second Corps, that was Winfield Scott Hancock's Corps. And at the end of our last presentation, actually October of 1864, he was just worn out. Hancock the Superb, and he decided to hand in his resignation and do something a little bit more peaceful for the end of the war. So his chief of staff, General Humphrey, took over. On the opposite side, you've got the Ninth Corps, you've got Major General John Parke, and he is taken over for Ambrose Burnside. And of course, that has everything to do with the disaster of the crater. That is not the extent of it, though. You also have the Army of the James, consisting of 2 corps and about a division's worth of forces that are currently guarding the Bermuda 100. The 15th Corps has 2 U.S. colored troop divisions. The entire divisions are U.S. colored troops. So the vast majority of that corps is made up of colored troops. And we're going to hear a little bit about them later. They performed very well in this campaign. And then you have the Army of Shenandoah. As we start tonight, the Army of Shenandoah is not in Petersburg. It's still up in the Shenandoah Valley, finishing off the rebel forces there, Jubal Early's forces. But by the time we get to March or April, Sheridan is going to be coming south and joining Grant's forces. And that's going to be critical for the rest of this campaign because he's got the bulk of the cavalry, and there is nobody in the Union Army who is more aggressive, who has that fighting spirit more than Sheridan does, Phil Sheridan. He has a cavalry corps under Major General Merritt, and when he was in the Shenandoah Valley, he also generally had Wright's 6th Corps with him, another good, solid fighting corps. Army of Northern Virginia, not much change here from what we've seen before. You've got James Longstreet now returned from this horrendous injury that he had at the Wilderness Battle. He came back to take command. It had been under the command of Lieutenant General Anderson, and Lee decided to go ahead and form a 4th Corps and give Anderson the command of that. But you notice it only has 1 division, so it's a very light corps. He also has the Department of Richmond, which this time is commanded by Lieutenant General Ewell. There's a name that we've heard quite a bit before, been kind of out of the picture for a while. He has a division, Lee's division. This is Major General Custis Lee, one of Robert E. Lee's sons, his oldest son, I believe. But Custis Lee doesn't have much combat experience, and his soldiers don't either. They are primarily naval sailors that are beached and no longer have any ships to fight on, some reserve forces, some scrap forces that they've thrown together that make up the Department of Richmond. Then you have the Cavalry Corps, much fighting the Cavalry Corps. Wade Hampton has been sent south to help out Johnston and to do some recruiting. So the former commander of the Cavalry Corps is out of the picture. That means that it transfers to Major General Fitzhugh Lee, Robert E. Lee's nephew. He is command. And you see one more Lee here, William Lee, otherwise known as Rooney Lee. That's another one of Robert E. Lee's sons who's one of the division commanders. So that makes up the Confederate forces. Winter at Petersburg. Life in the trenches. So what was life like for these soldiers? It was miserable. That's the easiest way to say it. It's got rain, cold, mud, lice, and monotony. And there's going to be a lot of quotes that I read tonight because I think that really illustrates better than I ever could what life was like and what these situations were like. Here's a Maine soldier describing it. We had an indefinable dread, our nerves subjected to continual strain, which we know cannot end till the war ends, or we will be wiped out. A Confederate officer talking about life at the front described it this way. This life in the trenches was awful, beyond description. It was endurance without relief, sleeplessness without exhilaration, inactivity without rest, constant apprehension requiring ceaseless watching. Not the least of the evils encountered was the unavoidable stench of the latrines. Now, that brings it home. Another New York soldier said, "We lived and ate and looked like troglodytes." Now, getting to the issue of monotony, that's always the soldier's fate. You're either in the heat of battle and scared to death, or you are bored to tears. And here's how a couple people have described it. Dull, duller, dullest. Nothing can exceed the monotony of camp life. And here's a Confederate staff officer. "We are waiting for something to explode. Killing time, for time was killing us." So, moving on then, I have a quote here of an artillery barrage, because when they're not bored to tears, as I mentioned, they're oftentimes scared to death, and artillery barrages became a fact of life, a normal routine. And they had artillery bunkers, mortar bunkers, but you still live for fear. If you got a direct hit, you might be in serious trouble. Here is one soldier's
In the daytime,
description.
the burst of smoke from the Confederate mortars could be seen. A black speck would dart into the sky and hang a moment, increasing in size, rolling over and over lazily, and the revolving fuse would begin to whisper audibly as it darted towards us. At first softly, "I'm a-comin', I'm a-comin'," then louder and more angrily, I'm coming," and at last with an explosion to crack the drum of the ear, "I'm here."
Snipers was another fact of life, especially for anybody who had the distinction, the honor of working on the picket line. You always wanted to keep your head down. You never knew who was scoping you out, quite literally, with their scopes right on your head, and they lived for fear. Although there were oftentimes or occasions and certain sectors of the line where there was kind of an unofficial truce, where the snipers really didn't go at each other. Now, some of the hotly contested areas, like the crater, they never really got over the fact that the Union forces had tried to punch the lines there, so they took the business of sniping seriously there. Raids for POWs was a factor as well, because you wanted to collect intelligence, much like we have during the First World War. But as I mentioned before, quite often there were unofficial truces. And here's what one soldier said about it. "When we weren't killing each other, we were the best of friends." And here's something universal about soldiers in combat, regardless of the theater of war they're at. In many respects, once they've been in combat for a long period of time, they have much more in common with that guy across no man's land than they have with their relatives back home that cannot begin to comprehend what their life is like in those trenches. Finally, desertions. By this time, especially in the Confederate side, but it worked both ways, the soldiers were demoralized and oftentimes thought that the only escape for them is to desert. And oftentimes the only way to desert was to cross no man's land and give themselves up to the enemy. Hard to imagine, but between February 15th and March 18th, something like 3,000 Confederates made that decision. 3,000. Maybe about 55,000, 58,000 at the beginning of January that Lee could count on. He could not afford to lose those soldiers. But as I said, it worked both ways. And a couple quotes here. Both of these are Union soldiers who are quoting. "Those who had simply deserted to the enemy and had been recaptured were shot, while those who, after deserting, had to avoid imprisonment, enlisted in the Confederate Army, and then again had deserted from that army into our lines, were hanged." The chief diversion, this different quote, "the chief diversion of the latter part of 1864 was attending of hangings in the vicinity. We were treated to a hanging exhibition every Friday, and the men had grown to enjoy the spectacle. We lose all human feeling towards such dastards and traitors." And what I've got here from William Hopkins of the 7th Rhode Island is a description of a hanging.
"The condemned were brought forth from the guardhouse and escorted to their fate in the following manner. A band playing a dirge, 2 coffins borne by soldiers, the 2 culprits, good-looking and apparently intelligent, with wrists handcuffed behind them, 2 chaplains, an infantry guard on either hand, and a cavalry guard surrounding all. The army overcoats buttoned about their shoulders were not removed, but they could not conceal their violent, though ineffectual efforts to free their hands, the drawing up of their feet, the heaving of their chests, or the spasmodic tremors that frequently darted through their frames, but constantly becoming weaker and more infrequent until they finally ceased.
In other words, for either side, there was just no escaping the fact of death. But there were distractions. Soldiers throughout eternity have looked for various ways to entertain themselves, and they generally found their own entertainment. Included theatrical groups, card games at that time. Euchre was one of those games. I'm sure there were plenty others. Poker, no doubt. Musical ensembles. Many of the regiments or brigades had their own bands that they used quite often, and they were regaled with the music, although I understand from Christian that didn't happen nearly as much at Petersburg as it had early in the war. Horse races and letter writing, but I'm going to let Mark talk more about that. I do want to mention one of the social occasions of the year for the Confederates. Hetty Carey was the belle of Petersburg society, and she was courted by all of the eligible bachelors, and finally General John Pegram won her hand, and they were married on January 19th, 1865. And one of those who saw the wedding writes this about Hetty. There was a murmur of delight at her beauty, her complexion of pearly white, the vivid roses on her cheeks and lips, the sheen of her radiant hair, and the happy gleam of her bright brown eyes seemed to defy all sours. The most beautiful belle of the South at the time, and now she's married. So those are the kind of distractions that they had. And at that time, I'd ask Mark to come up and tell us a little bit about the letter writing and poetry.
Thank you, Mark. Good evening, everyone. Good to see you out here on a somewhat interesting weather night. So Mark has asked me to give you some observations on what I've gone through in terms of letters from Civil War soldiers, especially those from Illinois. I've spent actually a number of months now over across the street at the Presidential Library going through Civil War soldiers' letters, particularly those that are originally from Illinois and in Illinois regiments, for example. First, a little bit of background. In terms of literacy, I've seen several different numbers for Civil War soldiers, both for Union and Confederate, and 80% is a good ballpark figure. It may be a little higher in some states, perhaps New England states, and a little lower in others. So in other words, 4 out of 5 Civil War soldiers could read and write. And very interestingly, letters were not censored by the military. So in that sense, soldiers felt very free to write whatever. They could write about Lincoln's administration and the prosecution of the war, about their own military commanders and generals, good or bad, about the Copperheads, perhaps, back in their home state in the North, and even regimental activities and movements and maybe where they would march next. Now, of course, in later wars, that, of course, would be like classified information, but back then, no, it wasn't. But it is wonderful for us as historians to read some of their unvarnished opinions. Few topics were seemingly off limits. So again, in some ways, it is almost like us as historians doing an oral history, in that the question is, so soldier, what is on your mind today, and what would you like to tell the folks back home? Well, all those thousands of letters, for example, are just across the street for us to explore and to learn more about history. Now, if you would go over and start looking at some of those letters in the manuscript reading room across the street, first thing you might notice, as we have here, is that it's in cursive writing. Now, those of us over 40, 50, and so on, that's no problem for us. I don't know that they teach cursive writing in grammar school, but that's the first thing that you would notice. The other thing, as you get into it, you would notice there's often very sparse punctuation. Not all sentences certainly do not end in a period. Commas are sparse. I probably read over 100 letters before I saw even a question mark, and it took about 500 letters before I saw an exclamation mark in any one of the letters. That just was not as common. And of course, the letters are going to reflect the era's sensibilities and writing styles. A typical letter, about, I'd say almost 1 out of 2, would start like this. Your favor of the 25th of March came to hand 3 days ago, and I now take pen to paper to answer you. Where, in essence, that favor part means I received your letter, and I thank you very much. As I read more and more of these letters, I realized that these letters, for many soldiers, were a necessity. And so I decided to title this slide, A Lifeline of Letters. I realized how important those letters, that communication, even though it took several days for a letter to get there and maybe several days more or weeks to get a reply back, was very important to soldiers on both sides for their morale and even mental health. Because as you read the descriptions of combat and what's on their mind and so on, some of it very detailed, you realizing that they're unloading some of their feelings to folks back home. Now, they would write to loved ones, friends, lady friends, etc., but also sometimes to editors. They would send a letter, an open letter, if you will, to a local newspaper editor back home to let them know, I saw in your paper about the battle. Well, I was at that battle, and here's how it actually went. And they also knew that sometimes when they wrote their own private letters, say to their folks were going to share it with the extended family, maybe the neighbors. Sometimes their parents, for example, would take that letter and take it to the local newspaper editor. They were always happy to get it if it would help sell more newspapers. So they knew sometimes what they wrote, even if it was just to loved ones, that sometimes it also became public. And I would say every third, every fourth letter would beg, ask, plead, or cajole to write more letters or to write more in each letter that they sent. And so here is a short quote, write a heap. That means bury me with letters. Or as this private John Meath here in the quote, and I'll read it for you, from Cook County put it, I often noticed my companions how tired and fatigued they would look after a long day's march. Some of them would almost seem as though life itself was a burden to them. But oh, what a change has come over their countenance. A change from sorry to joy. What has caused it? Has there been a great victory or has peace been declared? No. The mail has come into camp and they have received letters from loved ones at home. Yes, that accounts for it. For the time being, all their hardships and suffering are forgotten, all through the medicine of a letter. I really like that thought, a letter as medicine. I want to end up here with a little bit about pickets and pickets trading. Pickets, if you will, are the peripheral eyes and ears of the army. Whenever they're camped or they are in some sort of combat position, that is to keep them from being surprised by the enemy. And the enemy is doing exactly the same thing. So sometimes, even when they're in battle lines, but combat is not necessarily imminent, those pickets from opposing sides may be miles apart, but sometimes they were literally just tens of yards apart, especially when there was some sort of natural barrier between the two, like a creek or a river. So at that distance, if it was 100 yards, even 200 yards, and you're downwind, you can tell what they might be eating. You can tell if they have tobacco or not. You can hear them singing. You can hear them laughing, and so on. So there's often a lot of conversation then between pickets from opposing forces. And in the letters, they never say, oh, you would not believe what happened. We met the other picket. No, it always comes across as a matter of course as part of picket duty. And for privates and corporals, it came up quite often, perhaps every week or so. So they sometimes got to know the pickets on the other side, and so they would trade. So why would they trade and meet with them? Well, I have some things up here, but I've also written a poem that illustrates some of these things. And the poem is for 3 voices, so I would like to have Mark DePue and Christian McWhirter come up, and we'll read this poem. Mark will represent a Union picket, and Christian will represent a Confederate picket, and I'm a 3rd voice as a narrator. So, gentlemen, begin.
You there, what is the news?
Shouts he.
You have any coffee? Says me.
No, there are these unwritten rules that sort the quick ones from the fools.
What else you got to trade today?
Can you spare some sugar this way?
No officers should be in sight. They think fraternizing ain't right.
Is that some bacon I'm smelling?
Need tobacco, if you're selling.
Just 100 yards, there's the signs to cross no man's land between lines.
Have here some preserved pies, top shelf.
That hardtack you keep to yourself.
Military talk not allowed, nor politics among this crowd.
Here are newspapers from last week.
John has a story. Let him speak.
That's how we learn current events and make this war business less tense.
Quit taking all the euchre tricks.
What you got for whittling sticks?
Being neighborly beats bereft or mulling dark thoughts about death.
Any back home news from your wife?
Let's see again that pocket knife.
Peaceful commerce. Don't interrupt. A cannon shot makes us sit up, picked up quick as a deck of cards.
Give your general our regards.
They are parting words made on the trot, with giving as good as we got. Thank you, gentlemen. Christian.
Well, good evening. As we've already said a few times, I'm Christian, and thank you all for coming tonight, and thanks for Mark for giving me the opportunity to speak. Mark has given me what I think is the challenging task of summarizing music within the ranks in only 10 minutes, and I've also tried to make sure I don't repeat any of the information I gave last year. For any of you who came to my talk last year, I talked about music in the war, so we'll see if I pull it off or not. Anyway, I wanted to begin by saying I thought it was very fitting for those of you who some of you may already know this, but today, the anniversary of Appomattox, this very special anniversary, I think, was commemorated by 4 minutes of bell ringing across the country at 2:15 Central Time. They rang for 4 minutes to represent every year of the war. And personally, I found that was very fitting because the Civil War was a particularly musical war, and music was a quintessential part of the lives of Civil War soldiers. Furthermore, Civil War soldiers knew this. The Civil War was special because music was played all the time. Almost every aspect of camp life was somehow influenced by music, and this heavily experienced their memory of the conflict for years afterwards. The soldiers, the men, they brought their love of music with them into the ranks, both in the Army of the Potomac and the Army of Northern Virginia. They brought songs with them that they'd already known from home, songs they would sing with their families, songs they would sing with their friends, minstrel songs, sentimental songs like Home Sweet Home, probably the most popular song in America at the time, Annie Laurie and Lorena. But the martial spirit that imbued them when they first enlisted in 1861, and yes, I'm jumping way back before Petersburg, but I'll catch up, don't worry. When they first enlisted in 1861, the songs they heard at that time, these new martial songs, these anthems that conveyed to them what the war was about and resonated with them, those were the songs that I found they carried with them and that they performed most often and that after the war had the most meaning for them. Each side adopted 2 anthems that they carried with them through the war. I'm going to see if this music works. In the South, those 2 anthems were Dixie and the Bonnie Blue Flag, and I've got a medley of both those songs here. Success. This is, of course, Dixie. Here's the chorus. Bonnie-Blue flag. So these should be ringing some bells with you. I know Dixie probably more than this. Here's the chorus. I can't get this stuff. Hang on. Let's do it the cheap way. There we go. All right. In the North, the two anthems that they embraced were John Brown's Body, which I won't play for you tonight, but it had the same melody as the Battle Hymn of the Republic, which most of you know, and the Battle Cry of Freedom, which is the other song I've got to play for you tonight, although it has a long intro, so bear with me. You should probably recognize this melody. So these are the songs you would have heard them performing, and they carried these songs with them through the rest of the war. See, I told you I'd catch up. And so by the time they get to Petersburg, they're still singing and performing these same songs. And they take these songs through the siege of Petersburg. Sorry, Mark, I'm still going to call it a siege. And they take these songs with them all the way to Appomattox. But let me back up. The reason they love these songs so much is because these songs emboldened them. They explained to them why they were fighting the war. But also, by the time we get to Petersburg, these songs have gained a life of their own. The men on either side have come to link these songs with their wartime experiences, with all the suffering they've endured, with all the victories they've won, with everything that resonates with them for what their military life has been about. And in particular, these songs are important to them because they remind them of the people that they're enlisted with, those still alive and those who have died, and they become part of what we call small group cohesion among the military ranks. As a surgeon in the Confederate ranks, Junius Bragg recalled about Dixie, "Dixie brings to mind the memory of friends who loved it, friends the light of whose lives were extinguished in blood, whose spirits were quenched in violence." However, by the time we catch up to where Mark is today, these songs have started to change a little bit for both sides. In the Union, they know victory's coming. They're really starting to feel like they finally got it now. And so they start to adopt new anthems. They still cherish these old ones, but they also adopt new songs that serve not just as victory anthems for them, but also really define for them what the war had been about and the way they want to remember that war. And again, we've got two anthems in the Union. One is the Battle Hymn of the Republic. The Battle Hymn of the Republic is written in late 1861, published in early 1862, but it really doesn't catch on in the North until late 1864, early 1865. And part of the reason for that is because its lyrics provide a sense of comfort to the Union soldiers for what they think they were fighting for. The other one is Marching Through Georgia. Marching Through Georgia is a very kind of jaunty tune, but it shares with the Battle Hymn of the Republic a sense that victory has arrived and that victory is an emancipationist victory. The way they embrace these two songs illustrates how far the Union has come from 1861, when it was a war just about Union, to 1865, when many men in the ranks are defining this as a war to save the Union and destroy slavery. And the songs they choose to celebrate the end of the war reflect that idea, and it's the way they choose to define themselves and what they had done. In the South, the opposite is the case. In the South, many Confederates, both in the ranks and on the home front, start to abandon Dixie and the Bonnie-Blue flag. For them, these songs remind them of how they are losing, of those days in 1861 when they felt emboldened, when they felt proud, when they thought they were going to win. Now when they hear these songs, they sound bitter to them. They cause pain for them. And there's a period, really over a decade, from 1865 through the Reconstruction, when a lot of Southerners reject these songs because they see them as a painful reminder of the rebellion they once waged. It's not until the veterans start doing reunions in the late 19th century that Southerners embrace these songs again. But regardless of how these songs evolved and their preferences and beliefs, these soldiers always kept music close by. And the last thing I'll talk about today is a little bit about the kind of music these soldiers had, the way they played music for each other. Many literally carried their music with them in little books like this one. This is from our collection. These little books are called songsters. They are very small. This one we put this one in hardback for preservation purposes. Most of them were softcover. And most of them do not include any notation, although this one does. You can see, I don't know if you can see from here, but there's a little bit of notation here. But most of them just had the lyrics and would just give you the melody that you were supposed to sing it to. So for instance, the Battle Hymn of the Republic, if it appeared in a book like this, it would have the lyrics, it would say, "To the tune of John Brown's body." And soldiers kept these. They're perfect size to put in your pocket. Soldiers kept these, and they carried them with them through the whole war. And there's tons of them all over this country in libraries everywhere, just like this one, which is, from what I see, a testament to how cherished these things were, because the soldiers kept them. And they kept them throughout the war, and their families kept them, and then they donated them to libraries. However, they also carried the means of making music with them. Their voices, of course, they had with them all the time. Group singing, for any of you who've seen me speak before, group singing was extremely common in the 19th century, so they were perfectly comfortable singing around each other, but they also knew how to play instruments. Soldiers brought along guitars, banjos, fiddles. They did the string instruments in particular. They brought into the ranks with them. These weren't professional musicians for the most part, but if they brought an instrument from home, it tended to be a string instrument, and these would be used mainly in camp. But there was also a large class of professional musicians attached to the Civil War ranks. The first class of those is field musicians. Field musicians had long been a part of military tradition throughout the Western world. These were fifers, drummers, and buglers. And their primary function was to issue orders by performing certain calls and certain rolls on the drums. And there were 2 for every company on average. They were paid pretty well. We generally think of them today as being children, but they really weren't. Some of these guys have been in the Army their whole lives. And as a result, they became a kind of part of military culture and Civil War military culture. This is a sketch from the Civil War. This is of field musicians. This is a field musician in front of that camera on the bugle playing reveille. And these are 4 field musicians playing tattoo. These guys became kind of a romanticized part of the way soldiers were called and experienced their soldier life. Later in life, they would always remember that what these field musicians played, and it takes them, hearing reveille, hearing tattoo, hearing meal call, takes these guys right back into their time in the ranks. However, they also kind of hated these guys because they hated getting up in the morning and they hated going to sleep. And so a lot of the soldiers made up joke lyrics for these calls. And I'll read a couple to you here from my book, available on Amazon, and in the gift shop, now in softcover. Reveille has long been made fun of by soldiers, right up to World War II. And the lyrics Civil War soldiers had it were very typical of what you hear today. I can't wake him up, I can't wake him up, I can't wake him up in the morning. I can't wake him up, I can't wake him up, I can't wake him up at all. The corporal's worse than the private, the sergeant's worse than the corporal, the lieutenant's worse than the sergeant, and the captain's worst of all. I can't wake him up, I can't wake him up, I can't wake him up in the morning. One of my favorites was meal call. Soupy, soupy, soupy without any bean. Porky, porky, porky without any lean. Coffee, coffee, coffee without any cream. And my personal favorite, sick call. Are you all dead? Are you all dead? No, thank the Lord, there's a few of us left. There's a few left yet. So you can see a certain kind of soldier's gallows humor and snarkiness behind these lyrics. All right, but what really made the Civil War special in the history of American warfare in particular was the preponderance of another class of professional soldiers, the regimental bands. The regimental bands were almost every unit in the Civil War, when they first enlisted, tried to get a regimental band to accompany them. The Civil War came at a critical moment in the history of band music in the Western world. The Germans had started developing these brass bands. They were usually attached to military units. They became really popular during the Crimean War in the French army. And when America started its Civil War, these bands had started to permeate the United States. And so every guy who enlisted, North and South, wanted a regimental band with his regiment. And there were tons of these guys. These bands could be as big as 24 members attached to a single regiment. Some regiments had a band for every company. I mean, these were phenomenal numbers of guys enlisting in these bands. Some of them were very good. Some of them were professionals. Some of them, not so much. One guy complained that he wanted his band to stop playing near the mess tent because it was souring the milk. All right, these guys had various opinions about these bands. But like the field musicians, they became a quintessential part of Army life in the Civil War. Robert E. Lee famously remarked, "I don't believe we can have an army without music." And he was saying this to a regimental band. So these bands were just quintessential. The commanders like Lee believed these bands were good for morale. Future President Rutherford B. Hayes remarked that a regimental band is better than food and clothing to give spirit to the men. That's how advantageous he felt these bands were. And so, like I said, there's a ton of these bands. In fact, there's so many of these bands that by 1862, there are literally tens of thousands of bandsmen enlisted in the Union Army. There are so many of them that the Union Army cannot afford them. And so in the summer of 1862, after the Union suffers several defeats on the peninsula, the Congress actually outlaws regimental bands. They take the best of these guys and they put them in a brigade band, and the rest of them they try to discharge. They estimate this will save up to $5 million. This is in 19th century dollars, $5 million. What's amazing about this isn't that they had to do this, it's that the soldiers love these bands so much they ignore this order. The bands remain, they hide them in the rosters, they pay a personal tax to keep them enlisted. Of course, the guys who don't like their band don't mind sending their bands home, but the rest of them keep their bands around. And after a while, these officers just give up. There's all these stories about officers encountering regimental bands going, well, you know, these are illegal. And the leader of the band going, well, you know, these guys could go play at your tent tonight. And the officer goes, oh, wait, I didn't see a band. And he walks away. These things happen all the time. So these bands are phenomenally important to these guys. On the Confederate side, however, though, it's a different story. The Confederates quickly realize they don't have the manpower for these bands. And there's no Congress, the Confederate Congress never takes any action against them, but these guys lay down their instruments, most of them do, and eventually take up muskets. And there are stories, as we just talked about with these picket lines, there are stories that by the time you get to Petersburg, Confederates are actually crowding the picket lines to listen to the Union bands because they've lost their own bands because they don't have them anymore. So all of this is to say then that music was quintessentially important to these Civil War soldiers. It gave them a sense of humanity, especially near the end of the war when conditions were becoming particularly inhumane. It gave them a connection to home. They would listen to this music, and in these letters that Mark mentioned, they would write home about the music. I was amazed how often I found soldiers writing home about the music or sending music home. And so this music was part of what kept these guys feeling like they were alive and from fighting off the real kind of despair that they could feel within the trenches. And it lasted throughout the war. It didn't dissipate, and it made Civil War camps one of the most musical camps, I think, in the history of warfare. So thank you, and I'll hand it back to Mark.
Thank you, Christian. I suspect I wasn't the only one who was tapping my feet as I was listening to that music there. This is probably the most photographed, or maybe almost the most photographed place in the Civil War. It's Lookout Mountain overlooking Chattanooga, and everybody who was there wanted to have their picture taken there. But now we have to move from the lighthearted and the fascinating world of letters and music to combat again, I'm afraid. But first, as they mentioned before, by the time you get to January, February timeframe during the war, most people recognized it was just a matter of time. And there was already talk of peace. get a few slides forward here. In fact, in 1864, Lincoln wrote to Horace Greeley, and he wrote this about the propositions, what terms of peace that he would expect. Any proposition which embraces the restoration of peace, the integrity of the whole Union, and the abandonment of slavery, and which comes by and with authority that can control the armies now at war against the United States, will be received and considered by the executive government of the United States. Now, once you get to January, and the Confederates start to realize that their days are numbered as well, but they're not nearly close to giving up in this notion of their own independence and their own nation, they start looking for options. Of course, their idea of peace includes sovereignty and includes the continued existence of slavery. And that is obviously the 2 points that they're never going to be able to find agreement. But President Davis writes a letter to Lincoln, says, why don't we have Lee and Grant get together and talk? Lincoln rejects that notion, but they do agree to send peace commissioners to start negotiations again. And on January 29th, 3 Confederate peace commissioners crossed the lines at Petersburg. And Alexander Stephens, the vice president of the Confederacy, is one of those people who's leading that contingency. That's on the 29th. Consider the timing here. On the 31st of January, the U.S. Congress, the House of Representatives, passes the 13th Amendment. The U.S. Senate had already done it many months before, but now it's a fact, and it goes out to the states for ratification by the states. And of course, if the Confederacy was to come back in the Union at that very point in time, there would be quite a few states that would not have accepted that particular amendment to the Constitution. But we all know that that was not going to be the case. The actual conference occurs on February 3rd on the River Queen, which is Grant's floating headquarters, if you will, on the James River. And they talk about several things. They start by talking about an alliance between the Confederates and the Union. Imagine this. The Union and the Confederate soldiers fighting together in Mexico against the French, who are at that time, you've got Emperor Maximilian, who's the puppet emperor of Mexico. Why don't we do that? Well, of course, that's roundly rejected by Lincoln. The next one is the future of slavery. And we know that that's not going to go anywhere. So there wasn't really much to talk about in that respect. But this third one came up. How about monetary compensation for slaves? You know, if you're not willing to let us keep slavery, and you're going to abolish slavery, that's property. And so we should be compensated for that. And Lincoln actually recommended that perhaps as much as $400 million in Civil War dollars, $400 million could be set aside to repay Southern slave owners. But these first two, these right here, that was a killer. That just was not going to happen. So the only thing that they could essentially agree on was the exchange of prisoners. And that seemed pretty straightforward. Always a big concern in any kind of peace negotiations that you have. If the war is going to continue then, and it obviously was, what is the strategy of the two commanders in theater? In Grant's case, he wants to continue to stretch the lines, just like he did all of the fall of 1864. Keep pushing the lines west, farther west. As you do that, you're stretching out the Confederates with much smaller numbers. Eventually, that line is going to break. It's going to be vulnerable someplace, and you're always trying to pursue that. It's not just a matter of stretching the lines. You want to get to the point where you can finally impose a siege. And to do that, you've got to cut the South Side Railroad, the Boynton Road. Those are the two main routes into Petersburg. And then obviously there's routes on the north side of the Appomattox River as well. But the big goal in Grant's mind, you do those things because what you really want to do is to get Lee and his forces out in the open field, away from entrenchment someplace, where if you're attacking him, you know that it's 3-1, and then you still have a tough time of defeating an enemy that's entrenched. If you got open terrain, then you can maneuver again, and perhaps you can have that decisive victory. That's what Grant wanted. For Lee's case, he was a realist. He knew that in his heart of hearts, he knew that the Confederates' days were numbered, but he was always audacious, always aggressive, looking for something to do. His proposal, his thought was, if you have to leave Petersburg, and that's obviously the goal that Grant has in mind, then to move his army west until you get to the Richmond-Danville Railroad. And once you get to the railroad, then you can put your army, much of it on the railroad, and drive down to Danville, which is in southwestern Virginia. And once you get there, you can move the army south into the Carolinas, link up with Johnston, Joseph Johnston's army that's trying to keep Sherman at bay at the time. Once you've joined up between between Johnston and Lee, then they can unite against Sherman, defeat Sherman, and then move up and take on Grant. That's a tall order. It's a very ambitious order, but that's where the Confederates were at the time. And I'll be talking about General Mahone's plan here in just a minute, kind of a corollary plan for that. Hatcher's Run. This is Grant's next attempt to stretch the line. And you see three basic blue lines here. You've got Gregg's Cavalry Division. It's going to make a sweep and move all the way here to Dinwiddie Courthouse and get close to the point where you can cut one of the supply lines into the Confederacy, into Petersburg. Then you've got Warren's 5th Corps that's going to displace as well, and you can see what the Union is doing. They're stretching their line. They're stretching it in this vicinity right here. And then Humphrey's 2nd Corps is going to be protecting the flank of Warren's 5th Corps as well. Those are the three movements. By the time you get to February 5th, already General Gordon is going to begin to attack. He's attacking the 2nd Corps here, first of all. As soon as that occurs, the other Union forces are going to start to shift back northeast to make sure that they're covering Humphrey. And like so many times, this is really a back and forth struggle. We could probably spend an hour just talking about the particular movements of something like this. February 6th, General Pegram attacks the 5th Corps. The Union line gets pushed back some, counterattacks, but pushed back again. It's during this engagement that General Pegram, who had just gotten married to the belle of the Confederacy, is killed in battle. There's a certainly ugly irony about combat in that respect. By the time you get to February 2nd, the 5th Corps counterattacks. They roughly stabilize the line. The Confederates lose less than the Union do in this battle, like they had almost every single battle before this point in time. But the bad part for the Confederacy is they've extended their line another 5 miles or so. They can't afford to keep manning the line like that. But that's typically how it's gone for half a year. And by this time, the siege had been going on for about 7 or 8 months. Fort Stedman, going to General Mahone's plan, one of the division commanders. In this case, Lee knows that he's in a predicament. It's just a matter of time. And General Mahone comes up with a significant plan, and it somewhat plays into Lee's grander scheme of things. Mahone's plan, I need to take a look at this in detail here for you. His plan is to make a concerted attack on the right wing of the Union Army. It's very close to the Appomattox River before it takes a western turn. At this part of the line is basically north-south. That's where the attack is supposed to be. At night, in the midst of the night, special squads will go out and clear paths in front of the Confederate line so that the Confederate troops can move forward. Then they will have picked men who advance quietly up to the Union pickets and take some of the pickets out. Then they will cut pathways through the Union abatis. You remember these cross sticks that they were preventing, kind of today's version of concertina wire. They had to take axes out to cut their way through those. Then they would have 3 100-man storming parties that would rush through in these 3 locations here and capture Fort Stedman, which is right here, and 3 artillery batteries, the 10th battery, the 11th, and the 12th. And all of this is happening in the pitch of night, in darkness, if you will. Nothing more confusing than when you're moving around in that kind of terrain, that kind of condition. Once those 3 100-man parties are through, then another 3 100-man parties come through, and their job is to reach the high ground, the significant terrain behind the front lines, and to seize that so they can control movement, prevent the Union from reinforcing. Once that occurs, then the rest of Mahone's corps comes through, peels off to the left and right, and start working their way down the trench lines. That's the plan. If it works that way, and the reason that Lee accepted was that would disrupt what the Union was probably attempting to do, cause the Union to contract their lines, which might give Lee enough breathing room to head his army west and then south and link up with Johnston, to give him enough time to do that. Risky. So, the attack begins, and it's at night, as I mentioned, and the first few phases of the attack go like clockwork. In fact, one of the interesting things was, here's going back to what Mark especially was talking about with the pickets. The Union pickets are hearing all this noise. It's 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock in the morning. Something's going on over there. What are you doing over there, Johnny? Never mind, Yank. Lie down and sleep. We are just gathering a little corn. You know, rations are mighty short over here. Now, in the honor of the day, when they did get close to the attack, and this one, and maybe this is an apocryphal story, but this is one that was preserved, one of the Confederate pickets yelled out, "Hello, Yank, wake up. Look out, we're coming." So, that's the way the attack began, but again, it went very smoothly for the first hour or so. But things start to turn. And even before you get to daylight, things are turning. You've got a couple Union commanders who have their heads screwed on straight and know how to react. They are seasoned soldiers by this time, and much of the Ninth Corps now is going to seal this penetration and basically blunt it. The other part is that you've taken 3 of these artillery batteries, but there are other artillery batteries on either side, and now you have the situation of enfilading fire. In other words, you're firing right down the throat of the Confederate forces sitting in here. Right down the throat. Now, this is Gordon's position right here, but eventually they're going to be back in the trenches, so these lines right here are a little bit later in the battle. In other words, finally the battle turns. It's not going to be a success. The Confederates just don't have enough soldiers to make it happen. And Lee, at about 5 a.m., decides to call it all off. And by 7 o'clock, the Confederates are running back across the lines. And one of the soldiers describes that experience of returning back across no man's land, now in daylight. "I only escaped capture by running as hard as I could a quarter of a mile through open fields swept by their fire, expecting every moment to be knocked over as the dead lay in long line, being killed attempting to get away as I did. And I can assure you, I drew a long breath of relief when I jumped into our works, for it was a miracle almost that I got through it safe." Casualties. Union suffered 2,134. They could be that precise. The Confederates, by this time in the war, were never precise, but the estimates ranged anywhere from 2,618, that's the official count on the Confederate side, but others thought it was as high as 4,000. That's soldiers Lee cannot replace. Grant can replace his troops. Lee cannot. So this was not a success. About that time, March 28th, a few days later, there is a council of war, so to speak. It wasn't officially called that, but once again, it's on the River Queen. And in this case, you've got 4 of the most famous commanding generals of the Civil War. Sherman, Grant, here's Abraham Lincoln, of course, and here's David Porter. the commander of the naval fleet in that region, and also very well acquainted with the rest of these gentlemen. They talked about two things primarily: the rest of the war, and then what's going to happen after the war is over, because it looks like it's just a matter of weeks or months. In the respect to the war, Grant was announcing that Sheridan's cavalry was just about ready to join his army, and that was going to make a big difference. It gives them a movement factor that they just didn't have before. And that once they've got Sheridan's cavalry, they're going to go after cutting that rail line again and trying to force Lee out in the open country. Lee would attempt to flee, and then Meade and Ord would pursue aggressively. That was the plan. And here's what Lincoln said. And I think, again, I'm going to be using a lot of quotes because it's so important to get the flavor, the attitude that these people had. Must more blood be shed? Cannot this last bloody battle be avoided? And then he goes on with this comment. Can't you spare more effusion of blood? We have had so much of it. That's Lincoln talking to his three top commanders. Later, Admiral Porter quotes Lincoln as saying this as his desire for what kind of peace terms to have. And this is also important. Get the deluded men of the rebel armies disarmed and back to their homes. Let them once surrender and reach their homes, and they won't take up arms again. Let them all go, officers and all. I want submission and no more bloodshed. I want no one punished. Treat them liberally all around. We want those people to return to their allegiance to the Union and submit to the laws. Both Lincoln and Lee on his side, it's always referred to the other side as those people. Those people. I'm not sure we would use that kind of vernacular today in discussing our enemies, but that's what they used at that time. That gets us to the next major engagement, Five Forks. Now, this is the first part of the battle, the 31st of March, and you see some significant movements. And first of all, let's start with Sheridan. Obviously, the cavalry can move much more quickly, and they're going to try to outflank. And here's South Side Railroad right here. That's the target. So Sheridan's moving out. You also see Warren's 5th Corps moving out and extending the flank even more. And Humphrey's 2nd Corps and extending the flank. So you've got these flanks right here protected, but Sheridan is out here by himself. Lee, once again, pulls off a miracle, perhaps, and can find enough forces thinning out his lines so he can challenge what's going on that the Union is trying to do. And he sends Picket with his division and another division and Fitzhugh Lee's cavalry to respond to this. And they first attack Sheridan in the flank on here on the 31st of March. You can see the route that Sheridan takes. This is another seesaw battle between the 31st, that first day or so of battle. But it's also important to remember as we talk about this particular engagement, as so often is the case in the Civil War, weather plays a role. It played a little bit of a role tonight, but imagine heavy rain, cold, you're wet, you've got thousands of soldiers walking down unimproved roads, mud roads. And before you know it, you start to sink into the mud, your horses start to sink in the mud, and it's just very difficult to move much at all. Warren especially has problems in moving some of the terrain. You can see here he's basically trying to move up this stream bed to a certain extent. That is problematic. So, by the 1st, you have a situation, early in the 1st, you have a situation where Sheridan has his cavalry arrayed right here, and he's able to get Warren's corps over to his right. And he comes up with a very aggressive battle plan. But the weather conditions were so bad, and the reports that Grant was getting were so poor that he made the decision, okay, that we can't pull this off. Let's call off this battle. It's not going to work. Sheridan gets on his horse, rides to Grant's camp, and spends time haranguing Grant and convincing him, General, we've got to attack. We've got the Confederates where we want. They have open flanks. They're exposed. We've got them where we want them. Grant gives up. He turns it over to Sheridan, and when he does so, because he's heard some reports recently, over a period of months, that Warren has been a little bit irascible and difficult to work with. He puts Sheridan in command and actually tells Sheridan, you have authority to relieve Warren if you want to, if you need to. Sheridan goes back, puts together this battle plan. Here you have Custer on the left flank, and he is directed to move to the the Confederate right flank, to outflank them. Warren's corps is primarily supposed to move straight north and get past the left flank of the Confederate lines, the exposed left flank. Their movement is going to go very poorly and slowly, as is often the case when you have those kind of weather conditions and that kind of heavy terrain. You know, the heavy shaded areas, you're talking about going through thick woods and oftentimes scrub brush as well. This is not easy terrain to move through. But that's the plan. The attack really doesn't get going until late in the afternoon. 4:15, you see Custer moving out successfully, more open terrain over here, and you see a couple of the brigades over here working well, just like they're supposed to, but some of Warren's units are kind of lost. They get muddled, but they get lost in the right way. And they end up flanking and getting behind the Confederates' lines. Now, all of this is kind of unknown to Sheridan some of the time. He hears about it after the fact. But this is the perfect environment. You've got the Confederates circled on both sides. So going to the next move here. In this case now you've got a corps right here, Crawford's corps, moving towards this line right here, the road that's an escape route for the Confederates. You've got Griffin coming around from the backside, as you've got Ayres' division coming straight against this entrenched positions, and they are able to bust through and really destroy and had forced the displacement of McGregor's artillery battery up the line here. So the Confederates in this case are in a pickle like they hadn't been in a long, long time. Now, I think I failed to mention something in the last slide. General Picket and General Fitzhugh Lee are the two senior commanders on the Confederate side. And since the weather was so bad and since they didn't expect the Union to do anything, they knew the Union pretty well, they don't do this kind of stuff, they don't make those kinds of risks, those two gentlemen decided to take an invitation and go to a shad bake about 1.5 miles north of the battle site. And at that shad bake site, just gorging themselves on this delicious shad, they were in this acoustic bubble and they couldn't hear the battle going on. And they'd also made the mistake of not putting anybody in charge when they left. That's a mortal sin for anybody in the military. You don't just leave your command and not tell people where you're going. So they're late to the battle. By this time they're coming in, but it's a bit too late to make any difference. And the battle goes very poorly for the Confederates. And you can see them rolling up the Confederate left flank, and you can see in this one already that Pickett's forces, what's remnants of them are heading back in the northwestern direction, escaping from the battlefield. And that's basically how it looks once you get done. Now, before this time, Lee had told Pickett, before Pickett decided to take a break and go to the shad bake, Lee had told Pickett, hold Five Forks at all hazards, protect road to Ford's Depot, and prevent Union forces from striking the Southside Railroad. I regret exceedingly your forces' withdrawal to Five Forks and your inability to hold the advantage you had gained. So a little bit of a reprimand even in that. Imagine how Lee's going to feel once he hears the word about this battle. There's the casualties. First casualty is this astounding victory, maybe the best in Warren's career other than Little Round Top, where he was the one who recognized the importance of that terrain and made sure Union troops got there in the Battle of Gettysburg, where he made his claim to fame. He is relieved by Sheridan, who is furious with what had gone on, even though they've had this astounding victory. Union casualties, look at the disparity there. Oops. 830 versus about 3,400. So much of that Confederate force was captured or killed. The large majority of them were captured. This battle now is known by many historians as the Waterloo of the Confederacy, because it was their death knell. The next piece then, the next phase of the combat, I think is fascinating. What do you suppose Grant's going to do the first thing he hears about the success they just had at Five Forks? And maybe a fourth of the Confederate force is out of the picture now. He knows that they are very thin across the entire Confederate line, and he orders a general advance the very next morning. And that's what you've got. April 2nd, you have attacks across the entire front. And we're just going to work from right to left here primarily. Parke's 9th Corps, you can see that the lines are closest there. It was roughly in this territory right here where Fort Stedman was. They have initial success as they move out, but Gordon is one of the best commanders the Confederates have. Another one of those seesaw battles, but eventually the Union is held at bay. Then you get to Wright's 6th Corps. They've got a long chunk of the terrain right here, and a couple portions of the 6th Corps attack. It's right here, in this part of the line against A.P. Hill's forces, that the Union has success. And again, it's primarily because these lines have been so thinned out. They're just not manned like they need to be anymore. In the respect that just like Mahone had done before, Wright's troops, they go forward with selected axemen, they chop through the barriers that they've got, and then they push through. And now here's what's especially interesting in this particular camp. Once these elements get through here, they basically go right down the Confederate trenches, cause them to kind of peel out, and then they get close to the Boynton Road, and they head back northeast again and head towards a line that Lee now is very hastily trying to assemble, moving Longstreet from the north side of the Appomattox over here to try to protect Petersburg, the core of their defense. So that's what the 6th Corps has done to great success. Then you've got the 24th Corps under General Ord. And his forces now, you can see it's going to take a similar route. They can kind of almost, with minimal resistance, walk through these defenses because Wright has eliminated those to a certain extent. And now they go against Fort Whitworth and Fort Gregg, and especially Fort Gregg. The battle there, the Confederates send a couple regiments, select regiments forward, some really hard-fighting units to hold those forts. It's, in some respects, later in that battle, it's hand-to-hand combat, very bloody. And here's a comment from a Louisiana soldier who was there. Fort Gregg raged like a crater of a volcano, emitted its flashes of dead fire, enveloping our flag of honor in flame and in the smoke of death. It was a terrific struggle and slaughter. And a Union soldier talking about the same place. The interior of the fort was a pool of blood, a sight which can never be shut from memory. The rebels had recklessly fought to the last. These are determined men by that time. They are seasoned soldiers and the best that either side had to offer. So they do fight to the last in many cases. But it's a tremendous defeat for the Confederates, and Lee now has little choice but to look for an evacuation of Petersburg. And that's the next step. Casualties. 3,900 for the Union, roughly 5,000 for the Confederates. And if you remember from the Petersburg presentation, in almost every battle that we had before, those numbers are always reversed. The Union always suffered much higher casualties than the Confederates. And now it's gone the other direction for the Confederates. And as I said before, and I'll say a couple of times more probably, Lee cannot afford to lose those men. He cannot replace them. The evacuation of Petersburg. Lee's evacuation plan for his forces in Petersburg itself to cross the Rappahannock River, to get across and take a left turn and move towards Amelia Courthouse. And he had already arranged that 35,000 rations were going to be on store that they'd moved down from Richmond, waiting for his army in Amelia Courthouse. Once there, if they beat the Union, and this is the key for the rest of this, if they beat the Union forces there, they can get to the railroad and head south and go to Danville and then keep going south once they get to Danville into the Carolinas and join forces with Johnston, just like he'd wanted to do before. It's a midnight evacuation, so the stroke of midnight, beginning of April 3rd, is when the evacuation begins. And by early morning, I think it was 4:38, something like that, the first Union troops start to sneak into Petersburg, expecting to find pickets or something there, but finding little or nothing except the enemy that had evacuated. Now, in the process of evacuating, you certainly don't want to leave anything for the enemy, so Lee directs that any kind of military munitions be destroyed. So you're talking about wagons are destroyed. You're talking about rail cars are destroyed. You're talking about tobacco warehouses. So imagine a huge tobacco warehouse going up with smoke and the stench of that's filling the air as well. So you've got the Union troops. The 1st Michigan had the distinction of being first into town. And we do have another quote here. This one is General Porter Alexander, the artillery commander for the Confederates, and his comments is saying, Petersburg burning.
It was after sunrise of a bright morning when we turned to take our last look of the old city for which we had fought so long and so hard. It was a sad, a terrible, and a solemn sight. The whole river front seemed to be in flames, amid which occasional heavy explosions were heard, and the black smoke spreading and hanging over the city seemed to be full of dreadful portents. I rode on, with a distinctly heavy heart, and with a peculiar sort of feeling of orphanage.
Of course, with Petersburg evacuated, there was no choice but to evacuate Richmond as well, the capital of the Confederacy for 4 years. The place that they had been successful holding the Union Army at bay for all those years. The Confederate government flees towards Danville. That's where they're going to reset up their operations. And you can imagine the kind of things that the government officials wanted to take with them. Their wagons were filled with whole paraphernalia of all kinds of different items. But the city was turned over to the engineer squads, the explosive squads, because they're going to do the same thing that was done in Petersburg. They're going to destroy anything of military value. But there were some other things that were going on there as well. In one case, there was a whiskey factory that was discovered, and those barrels were emptied into the gutters. And what do you suppose would happen with those who are hanging around Richmond still, with all that whiskey flowing through the gutters? Yeah, they're going to scoop it up in anything they can drink, anything they can find. There were a lot of people who are left. Now, the prisoners who were in Libby prison had already been evacuated down south in Georgia about a year before, but there were other kinds of prisoners. There were thugs and thieves and prostitutes and lots of deserters and lots of convicts, and they're kind of roaming through the city and causing general havoc wherever they go. And here's one description of what it was like at that time, watching the city burn in the background. It was an extraordinary night. Disorder, pillage, shouts, mad revelry of confusion. Mobs were seen besieging the commissary stores, destroying liquor, intent perhaps upon pillage and swaying to and fro in whatever momentary passion possessed them. The sidewalks were encumbered with broken glass. Stores were entered at pleasure and stripped from top to bottom. Yells of drunken men, shouts of roving pillagers, wild cries of distress filled the air and made the night hideous. So that's the evening of 3 April. And what's interesting, that's what it looked like the next morning in much of Richmond. And it was the next day that Abraham Lincoln showed up. He arrives at the dock now by that time General Weitzel and his 15th Corps had already arrived. Remember, he had 2 divisions of U.S. colored troops, black soldiers at the time. By this time of the war, these are disciplined, seasoned soldiers, and not only that, but by all accounts, they behaved themselves exemplary manner. They helped the poor. They fed some of the people who were near starvation. They actually went to Mary Lee's home and made sure that she was protected, set up guards outside of that. But when Lincoln shows up, he's got Admiral Porter, he's got about 12 guards, all armed with carbines, and his 12-year-old son. And that's it. And there's no other Union soldiers in sight when they get there. They are almost immediately besieged by all of these ex-slaves who recognize Abraham Lincoln immediately and start to come up and kneel at his feet and want to kiss him and want to talk to him and touch him and anything they wanted to do at all. It was an amazing scene. In fact, one gentleman came down, knelt on his knees, kissed Lincoln's feet, and Lincoln immediately protested and said, this gentleman said, "Bless the Lord, the great Messiah," and some other things after that. And Lincoln replies, "Don't kneel to me. That is not right. You must kneel to God only and thank Him for the liberty you will enjoy hereafter." Again, to get a sense of the man and that moment at the time. Shortly after this, Porter is able to find a platoon of cavalry that come to their rescue, and after walking a couple miles, they even find a carriage for the president, and he can tour the city after that in the carriage for a while. But an extraordinary moment, taking some great risk, arriving very shortly after the scene of battle in a chaotic city. The Confederates' flight west, and you've got different version of these same maps, and hopefully you can tell. It looks rather confusing on here. But what you're looking at is various routes that the Confederates and the Union are going to be taking to the west. Now remember, as much as possible, Lee wanted to get a jump on the Union. That's the key. You get out of the city quicker, you have a chance of of getting west and then getting south like you want. The trick is that you want to beat the Union forces. Now, at one point in time, General Meade, who's the commander of the Army of the Potomac, is talking to Grant and says, the thing to do here is to pursue. That's the ultimate thing that any general officer a strategist is going to want to do at this time. You pursue, you dog their heels, you engage in combat, you keep gnawing away at the back until you can catch up to them and destroy them. And here's Grant's reply at that point in time. My reply was that we did not want to follow him. We wanted to get ahead of him and to cut him off. Pretty simple. And he had the perfect tool to do that. Phil Sheridan and his cavalry. You want to get ahead of them and cut them off. So here's the routes that they had. And several routes to begin with. You've got, first of all, Pickett's forces at the 5 forts that are defeated. They're going to take this route and move south of the Appomattox River to Amelia Courthouse, where again they're all hoping that they're going to run into some supplies, because almost all of these soldiers in the Confederate side are starting this journey, most of them on foot, with no food. They're already close to starvation, and they've got no rations to take with them. So that's Pickett's forces. The main force in Petersburg, Longstreet, Lee, and Gordon's forces are on the north side of the Appomattox River. I said Rappahannock, it's the wrong river. Appomattox River, and moving towards Amelia Courthouse there. Then you've got the troops that were in Bermuda 100, and you've got the forces that were in Richmond. Ewell and a wagon train, and much of that wagon train in this case are civilians, government officials, and you can imagine the hodgepodge of vehicles that they would have had on that route, all trying to converge in Amelia Courthouse. They get there, lead forces get there on April 4th. Union, with Sheridan in the lead, and very quickly, as much as possible, the Union infantry following close behind. And to a certain extent, by this time in the war, they know the gig is up. If they can march fast, if they can keep up a pace, they can beat the Confederacy at their own game. And for those who've been to many of these lectures before, you know that the Confederate Army was superb at being able to march fast and exceeding anybody's expectations of how far a soldier can march in one day. So the Union forces, they said, okay, we might even get ahead of our supply lines. It's worth doing. We'll be hungry, but we're better fed and better shape than they are. We'll get there first. That's their goal. Grant's pursuit of the rebels, I already talked about the importance of doing the pursuit correctly. You've got rebel soldiers who are relieved, finally, of being out of the trenches. After something like 10 months in those trenches, even though they're starving, they're not in the trenches anymore. They're on the move. They feel like they're doing something. But they're near starvation, and they are totally exhausted. And now they're expected to march day and night. In many cases, day and night, without hardly any rest at all. What would you expect to happen? But hundreds and thousands of stragglers start to fall out. The biggest group of stragglers are those people from Richmond who weren't seasoned combat veterans in the first place, the ones who were under General Custis Lee's command. They started with something like 6,000, and quickly you've got, by the time you're in about 2 or 3 days, you're down to 3,000. That gives you a sense of the scale of the stragglers in that respect. But it's not just the men who are exhausted and near starvation. You've got the horses and the mules that are already there as well. And they're falling over, and they're dying, and they're caught in the mud. And before you know it, you're leaving more and more and more of the riffraff of your soldiers, but all the accoutrements of an army are laying by the side of these roads as well as they move west. They get to Amelia Courthouse, and Lee finds not 35,000 rations, but 0 rations. Nothing. And can you imagine the sinking feeling his army has at that time? There are munitions there. There are lots of artillery caissons there. That doesn't feed his army very well. And now Lee has a problem. He needs to get his army assembled at Amelia Courthouse, first of all. Instead of being scattered on 5 different routes, they need to consolidate there. And that's going to take almost a day to do that. But the other problem is there's no food. So he directs his quartermasters out in the countryside on the 4th and into the 5th of April. This is precious time he does not have. The Union is on the move. They send out to the countryside and basically go begging for food. By this time in the war, these farmers don't have any food. They've been stripped clean long before that. And basically the only thing these wagons come back with is some field corn. Corn that you'd want to feed to the livestock and not the troops. And that's essentially what the troops have to eat for the next couple of days. That is it. So you imagine how more people start to drop out and they decide it's better to surrender or just to kind of drift off into the woods someplace looking for anything to eat. And by this time, by the 4th and the 5th, you've got Union troops to the south. They have cut off. They're not in Amelia Courthouse. They are on the rail line a couple miles south of Amelia Courthouse. And so Lee knows he can't go south. He has no other course but to go west again and to move his troops as fast as they can physically go. The next place then where there is going to essentially be trapped is Sailor's Creek. Now I wanted to talk real quickly about the rebel order of march as they leave Amelia Courthouse. And this thing can stretch out over miles. Longstreet's in the lead with Heth's corps, that's easy to say, Heth's corps, in close following behind that. Then Anderson's small corps, remember there's only one division there, and Ewell's Richmond garrison follows that. And then the Army trains, and Gordon's corps follows the Army trains. After going a couple miles, they discovered, and of course the Army trains and Gordon's corps are the very last to be leaving, and they discovered that they really need to turn north, and so they take a movement north, and Gordon follows the trains as they turn north. That puts Anderson's small corps and Ewell's Richmond garrison basically at the tail end, and they're being dogged as they go through this whole operation. Once they get to Sailor's Creek, they cross about 3/4 of a mile, and they discover that they're in this vice again. To the south is a division under Merritt, right here. Actually, a couple divisions of cavalry, and they take on Picket and Johnson, generally Anderson's corps as well. And in the north, you've got Ewell in command. He's got one division, a seasoned division with Kershaw here, and then he's got this hodgepodge of forces. And again, you've got some combat that's going on where the Confederates in some cases are holding their own and proving themselves to be every bit as good as they ever were in the past, but they're overwhelmed by the numbers. And it quickly turns to the Union side, and you have once again the remnants of Pickett's forces, the remnants of Ewell's forces, but especially Pickett's forces, are able to escape. Ewell, something like 8 other general officers, and 6,000 others are casualties. The vast majority of those are captured. So General Ewell and 8 other generals and 6,000 soldiers are removed from the ledger of the Confederate Army at that time. So you can see how Lee's forces are whittled down day by day as they move west. What's after that then? Lee has to make more adjustments to the plan. The next fight is going to be at High Bridge. There's High Bridge. It truly is a high bridge. Right next to it, that's a railroad bridge right there that extends over the Appomattox River. Close to that is a wagon bridge that was much lower. But the Union forces, once again, there's a couple cavalry troops that get there first and try to control that bridge. The Confederates know they have to have control of that bridge. So Longstreet's rear guard takes them on the 6th of April. An attack. In a seesaw battle, but finally Longstreet's troops are able to overcome the resistance because there just wasn't enough Union forces there, and hold the bridge long enough so that the rest of their army can get through, and then to continue to hold the bridge. And the rear guard action by the Confederates now is going to be Mahone's units, and the last thing they want to do is to burn those 2 bridges. Unfortunately for them, they're successful in burning parts of the High Bridge, but not putting to torch entirely the wagon bridge. So the Union forces are going to be able to use that bridge to continue the pursuit. And by the meanwhile, you've lost more soldiers in the plan. Now, Lee's plan is you hope to get to Farmville. And at Farmville, maybe you can get some supplies. And you see the Farmville is close to the rail line here. This is the South Side Railroad. And more likely, you really hope to get to Appomattox Station right here. Now, it's just a mile or so south of Appomattox Courthouse. Appomattox Courthouse was this major way station between Richmond and Danville, or Lynchburg, I think it was at that time. And then once the railroad was built a mile or so south of that, it's kind of a backwater. It didn't amount to too much anymore. But Lee had heard that on this rail line right here, there is a supply train waiting for him with some rations. But again, he's got to get there first. He can't afford to have the Union get there first. And put all these pieces together. His soldiers are starving. They're exhausted. They're falling out left and right. And he's just trying to get the forces, pushing them forward as much as he can. It's looking very grim. And both sides know it. So at this point in time, they start thinking about, especially the Union side, they start thinking about peace. And remember back to those comments that Lincoln made on March 28th on the River Queen, told his commanders at the time. That rebels would at once be guaranteed all their rights. I want no one punished. Treat them all liberally all around. We want those people to return to their allegiance to the Union and submit to the law. So, late on April 6th, Sheridan mentions to Grant, if the thing is pressed, I think Lee will surrender. Grant passes some information back to Lincoln, who's keeping close link with on telegraph. And the comment that comes back from Lincoln, let the thing be pressed. Grant to Lee. Grant opens the first opportunity and writes to Lee on 5 p.m., April 7th. The results of the last week must convince you of the hopelessness of further resistance on the part of the Army of Northern Virginia in this struggle. I feel that it is so, and regard it as my duty to shift from myself the responsibility of any further effusion of blood by asking of you the surrender of that portion of the Confederate States Army known as the Army of Northern Virginia. 9:30 that night, that message gets to Lee, and in his tent, he's also got General Longstreet with him, his old war horse, his right-hand man. Lee reads it, passes it to Longstreet. Longstreet reads it, looks up and says simply, "Not yet. Not yet." So they have to have some kind of response to Grant. And here's the response. "I have received your note of this date, though not entertaining the opinion you express on the hopelessness of further resistance on the part of the Army of Northern Virginia. I reciprocate your desire to avoid useless effusion of blood, and therefore, before considering your proposition, ask the terms you will offer on condition of its surrender." It's a glimmer of opening there. Not willing to give up the fight yet, but maybe it would be the kind of terms that Lee and the Confederacy could accept. Here's the response now that Lee gives. And remember, that Grant gives him. This is unconditional grant, unconditional surrender grant. That was the terms at Fort Donelson early in the war that he became famous throughout the newspapers and throughout the North. Unconditional surrender grant. Here's what he now offers to Lee. That the men and officers surrender shall be disqualified from taking up arms again against the government of the United States until properly exchanged. That's the essence of it. The men and the officers. And this is very significant to Lee and to his officers, who could very well be considered traitors. What's the definition in the Constitution of a traitor? Anybody who takes up arms against the United States. A citizen who takes up arms against the United States. They fit the classic definition. There is absolutely no hint of this in Grant's statement. There was no hint of that in what Lincoln was telling his officers. But this is in the midst of both these armies moving back and forth, so communication is a bit spotty, to say the least. And Lee now says, "To be frank, I don't think the emergency has arisen to call for the surrender of this army." And when Grant hears that, his only comment is, "It looks as if Lee still means to fight." Here's another very important, significant moment in American history that I think is lost to most of us. It's on this time frame, early morning of the 9th. Now Lee's army is approaching or already arrived north of Appomattox Courthouse, and they know by that time there's at least some Union cavalry, it's on the south side, that has already gotten to Appomattox Station first, and those supplies first. At that point in time, one of his officers recommends that perhaps guerrilla warfare is the best approach to how to carry on the war. Now, I hadn't mentioned before what Jeff Davis's opinion was. He still wanted to continue the fight, and here's one of the things that President Jefferson Davis said about the issue of guerrilla warfare. We have now entered upon a new phase of the struggle, the memory of which is to endure for all ages. Relieved from the necessity of guarding cities and particular points, with an army free to move from point to point and to strike in detail detachments and garrisons of the army, operate in the interior of our own country, where supplies are more accessible, nothing is now needed to render our triumph certain but the exhibition of our own unquenchable resolve. Now, colorful words for a way to say guerrilla warfare is the approach we want to take from here on out. That's the only rational approach to take. And there were plenty of examples in the Confederacy where that was a tactic that was used. It was certainly not unknown to the South. You've got John Mosby and his raiders in the Eastern Theater. Probably the most famous, Nathan Bedford Forrest, perhaps the best cavalry commander the United States Army has ever produced. He fought for the Confederacy. He was the terror of the Western region. You've got John Hunt Morgan, who terrorized Kentucky and Middle Tennessee. And finally, in the truest sense of what it meant to be a guerrilla, or maybe a terrorist in the terms we would use today, William Quantrell. His most infamous raid is on Lawrence, Kansas, in I think 1863. Yes, in 1863. He raided the town. They basically rounded up any men and boys they could find, and by the time they left town, 150 men and boys had been slaughtered and much of the town ransacked. in the truest sense of what it meant to be a guerrilla warrior. So there was examples of this. But this was not what Lee had in mind. When Alexander recommended it to him, Alexander says, "We would be like rabbits or partridges in the bushes, and they could not scatter to follow us." And Lee's response, perhaps the ultimate soldier who understood his own notion of what honor meant, "We must consider its effect on the country as a whole. And as for myself, you young fellows might go bushwhacking, but the only dignified course for me would be to go to General Grant and to surrender myself and take the consequences of my act." That was Lee's comment, and that was Lee's decision, and the Army of Northern Virginia honored that. So, after 4 years, at least for the Army of Northern Virginia, there's one more battle to be fought. And that's on the morning of April 9th, and it's an attempt to punch through the Union cavalry and to get to those rations at Appomattox Station, and then to continue the fight and to move south and to link up with Johnston. You've already gotten a good picture of the condition of the Army by that time. General Gordon and his corps is given the opportunity to lead the attack south against Sheridan by that time. And that's really all they know that's there right at that moment in time. Sheridan and a couple cavalry units. They know that Meade, with a couple corps, is dogging him on the north. So Longstreet is doing all he can just to hold Meade off on the north side, while Gordon tries to punch through the south. Early morning attack. He's successful to push back the screen of dismounted cavalry. They get up to the crest of this small hill, and in front of them is arrayed 2 entire corps of Union infantry. In fact, the entire Army of the James is waiting for them on the south side. And at that time, Gordon knows that it's up, it's over. Colonel Venable, one of Lee's staff officers, rides up to Gordon and asks him his opinion of the situation. "Tell General Lee I have fought my corps to a frazzle, and I fear I can do nothing unless I am heavily supported by Longstreet's corps." Longstreet has his own problems. Venable takes that message back to Lee, and Lee's comment, here's one that goes down in the history books: "Then there is nothing left for me to do but to go and see General Grant, and I would rather die 1,000 deaths." That leads to April 9th then, later in the day. Now it's up to Lee to find a place to actually meet with Grant, and sends one of his staff officers into Appomattox Courthouse looking for that place, now that they have somewhat control of the city. And what they find is this home of Wilmer McLean. And here's one of the great ironies of the Civil War. Wilmer McLean, many of you know this story already, he lived in Manassas, Virginia at the beginning of the war. His house was actually used by General Beauregard as Beauregard's headquarters during the Battle of Manassas, the first Battle of Bull Run. And McLean said, "I am tired of this nonsense. I'm going to move someplace else away from the war. They can't bother me anymore after that." And now, one of Lee's staff officers has selected his home for the surrenders. Lee arrives. Grant arrives 30 minutes later. Lee is dressed impeccably, wearing his best uniform, sword on the side, his dress uniform. Grant had been suffering from a severe headache, a migraine headache, for several hours, wasn't even able to sleep. As soon as he heard the word that Lee was waiting for him to talk about the surrender, his headache went away, got on his horse, he rode to Appomattox Courthouse, got there 30 minutes later. The two officers talked a little bit outside of McLean House. They had actually met way back in the Mexican War. Lee was a much more senior staff officer at the time. He didn't remember Grant. Grant remembered Lee. People who met Lee remembered Robert E. Lee. They exchanged a couple of pleasantries. They talked about that experience. Grant was a little bit nervous, melancholy about the notion of what lay ahead of him. And we think it would be just the reverse. And it was Lee then that brought them back to the subject at hand. General, I think we need to talk about our surrender. So they walk into the house. Here is the best, most accurate picture of what that surrender ceremony looked like in the house itself. And as they discussed it, Grant finally took one of his order books out and started to write down the terms of the surrender, what the surrender agreement would actually be like. Once he got that done, one of his staff officers handed it over to Lee to read. And here, the best thing to do is to get a sense of what those surrender terms actually are, and I think that's on one of your handouts.
In accordance with the substance of my letter to you on the 8th, I propose to receive the surrender of the Army of Northern Virginia on the following terms, to wit, rolls of all the officers and men to be made in duplicate, one copy to be given to an officer to be designated by me, the other to be retained by such officer or officers as you may designate. The officers to give their individual paroles not to take up arms against the government of the United States until properly exchanged, and each company or regimental commander sign a like parole for the men of their command. The arms, artillery, and public property to be parked and stacked and turned over to the officers appointed by me to receive them. This will not embrace the sidearms of the officers, nor their private horses or baggage. This done, each officer and man will be allowed to return to his home, not to be disturbed by the U.S. authority, so long as they observe their paroles and the laws in force where they may reside.
Lee received that order, took his glasses out, cleaned the glasses, put them on, read it, and here was his response. This will have a happy effect on my army. Generous terms. Then he reflected, and he mentioned that unlike the Union Army, the Confederate Army, the soldiers in both the cavalry and the artillery owned their own horses. And after all, it was planting season. And would it be possible if they could take their horses along with them as well? Grant immediately responded, well, that wasn't in the terms of the agreement. And then after reflection, changed his mind and says, if they can prove that they need them for their work on the farm, then they are free to take their horses along with them as well. And Lee says, this will have the best possible effect on the men. It will be very gratifying and will do much towards conciliating our people. And that's the surrender. 3:15 Eastern Standard Time. Lee also mentioned there was 1,000 prisoners that they currently had, Union prisoners that were starving. They couldn't have any food to feed them. So Grant said he'd be happy to take over those prisoners and also to feed the Confederate Army as much as possible. After the surrender, the two men go outside. Lee goes out first. As he approaches his horse, the officers take off their hats and render a salute. And Lee, very unconsciously, goes like this, clenched fist while he's wearing his gloves. Then he mounts the horse. Grant comes out, taps his hat. Lee does the same thing and then rides off. That evening, as word spread throughout the Union camp, there was great celebration, as you might expect. People hooting and hollering, screaming and yelling and just having a grand old time until Grant sends out the word. At once, I sent the word to have it stopped. The Confederates were now our prisoners, and we did not want to exult in their downfall. The war is over. The rebels are our countrymen again. These are amazing moments in history, I think. They reflect on the way they treated each other. they had to print out parole papers. The next 2 days, a printing press was set up, and they printed out these paroles that every one of the Confederates had to have with them if they were going to be able to not be harassed on the roads after that, to be able to prove that they were part of Lee's army and were surrendered. This was a point of shame for the Confederate soldiers at the time. Most of them carried it for much of their life on their persons. And 10 or 20 years from then, you can imagine the amount of pride that these soldiers would take. I was at Lee at Appomattox at the end of the war. Lee had to send some kind of message to his troops, and that's the next quote. Lee's General Order Number 9, otherwise known as his farewell address.
After 4 years of arduous service marked by unsurpassed courage and fortitude, the Army of Northern Virginia has been compelled to yield to overwhelming numbers and resources. I need not tell the survivors of so many hard-fought battles who have remained steadfast to the last that I have consented to the result from no distrust of them. But feeling that valor and devotion could accomplish nothing that could compensate for the loss that must have attended the continuance of the contest, I've determined to avoid the useless sacrifice of those whose past services have endeared them to their countrymen. By the terms of the agreement, officers and men can return to their homes and remain until exchanged. You will take with you the satisfaction that proceeds from the consciousness of duty faithfully performed, and I earnestly pray that a merciful God will extend to you his blessing and protection. With an unceasing admiration of your constancy and devotion to your country, and a grateful remembrance of your kind and generous consideration for myself, I bid you an affectionate farewell.
For decades after the war, just like young boys, young girls in the North would recite the Gettysburg Address and take great pride in that, many young Southerners were being taught to recite Lee's General Order Number 9, holding on to the significance of that. This isn't quite the end. One of the things Grant insisted on was some kind of a formal surrender ceremony. Lee was hoping that the soldiers of his army could simply stack their arms and their flags and walk away from their camps. Grant wanted something that they would remember and carry for the rest of their lives. So, the day after the surrender, 3 senior officers from each side got together and discussed the terms of the surrender. And they're basically, the only guidance they had was keep it simple, keep it short. And they selected 2 people. On the Union side, they selected General Joshua Chamberlain. You remember Chamberlain from Gettysburg as well, and from many battles after that, had been wounded 6 times in the war, most seriously in Petersburg campaign. And General John Gordon on the Confederate side had been wounded himself 4 times, one of their best field commanders. Much of the Union Army was already leaving by the time the surrender ceremony occurred on the 12th. It was a cold, drizzly, rainy day. We're used to that around here right now. And I think it's much better to hear Chamberlain's description of the surrender than to listen to me talk about it. And 2 quotes in that respect.
I was told that General Grant had appointed me to take charge of this parade and to receive the formal surrender of the guns and flags. Pursuant to these orders, I drew up my brigade at the courthouse along the highway leading to Lynchburg. This was very early on the morning of the 12th of April. The Confederates were stationed on the hill beyond the valley, and my brigade, the 3rd, had a position across that valley on another hill, so that each body of soldiers could see the other. My men were all veterans, the brigade being that which had fired the first shot at Yorktown at the beginning of the war. Their banners were inscribed with all the battles of the Army of the Potomac, from the first clear through the long list down to the last. The arrangement of the soldiery was as follows: the 3rd Brigade on one side of the street in line of battle, the 2nd, known as Gregory's, in the rear, and across the street facing the 3rd, the 1st Brigade also in line of battle. Having thus formed the brigade standing at order of arms, the head of the Confederate column, General Gordon in command, and the old Stonewall Jackson Brigade leading, started down into the valley which lay between us and approached our lines. But it was a most impressive sight, a most striking picture. to see that whole army in motion, to lay down the symbols of war and strife, that army which had fought for 4 terrible years after a fashion but infrequently known in war.
Now, Christian told us before the importance of these regimental bands and of musicians. There were no bands. There were no drums. They kept it as simple as they possibly could. And to illustrate that, here's the second part of Chamberlain's quote.
At such a time and under such conditions, I thought it eminently fitting to show some token of our feeling, and I therefore instructed my subordinate officers to come to the position of salute in the manual of arms as each body of the Confederates passed before us. At the carry arms, as it was then known, with musket held by the right hand and perpendicular to the shoulder. When General Gordon came opposite me, I had the bugle blown, and the entire line came to attention. The general was riding in advance of his troops, his chin drooped to his breast, downhearted and dejected in appearance almost beyond description. At the sound of that machine-like snap of arms, however, General Gordon started, caught in a moment its significance, and instantly assumed the finest attitude of a soldier. He wheeled his horse facing me, touching him gently with the spur, so that the animal slightly reared, and as he wheeled, horse and rider made one motion, and horse's head swung down with a graceful bow, and General Gordon dropped his sword point to his toe in salutation. At a distance of possibly 12 feet from our line, the Confederates halted and turned facing toward us. Their lines were formed with the greatest care, with every officer in his appointed position, and thereupon began the formality of surrender. Bayonets were affixed to muskets, arms stacked, and cartridge boxes unslung and hung upon the stacks. Then, slowly and with a reluctance that was appealingly pathetic, the torn and tattered battle flags were either leaned against the stacks or laid upon the ground. The emotion of the conquered soldiery was really sad to witness. Some of the men who had carried and followed those ragged standards through the 4 long years of strife rushed, regardless of all discipline, from the ranks, bent about their old flags, and pressed them to their lips with burning tears. And it can well be imagined, too, that there was no lack of emotion on our side, but the Union men were held steady in their lines, without the least show of demonstration by word or by motion. There was, though, a twitching of the muscles of their faces, and, be it said, their battle-bronzed cheeks were not altogether dry. Our men felt the import of the occasion, and realized fully how they would have been affected if defeat and surrender had been their lot after such a fearful struggle.
I think Chamberlain does a wonderful job of painting the picture. You don't even need to have this picture to look at to see exactly what's happening. And the other thing that strikes me listening to this and trying to comprehend it, it's that this moment again, as Grant had talked before, that they're all Americans again, that they're going to try to put the war behind them and recognize the things that they shared in common. That's why I think this is the most poignant moment in American history, and it gives me goosebumps even to think about it. Unfortunately, 2 days later, as I mentioned before, the most tragic event in American history, and I don't need to lay out too many of the details. You all know the details of Lincoln's assassination. He and Mary decided to celebrate, go to Ford's Theater on the evening of the 14th to see My American Cousin, a nice relaxing comedy. They take a young couple along with them, an engaged couple, to enjoy the scene. They get to the theater a little bit late. The orchestra sees them enter, strike up Hail to the Chief, and they settle in and relax. What I wanted to do, rather than to tell you the rest of the story, is to tell you the story from this person's perspective. This is George Sizer, formerly of the 24th Iowa Volunteer Infantry, had fought with Grant at Vicksburg and Champions Hill, had gotten banged up quite a bit, and then went down to Louisiana and got a serious case of malaria, so he was considered unfit for combat duty and put into the Veterans Reserve Corps. That's why he's on patrol in Washington, D.C. the night that Lincoln was shot, because he's no longer fit for frontline duty. But during the whole war, he wrote to Tamar Bates, his sweetheart, back in Iowa, something like 140 letters. And he wrote rather extensively about his memories of that night while he was on patrol. And 20 years later, I suspect writing this synopsis again so he could give a speech to either a Remembrance Day, maybe the 4th of July celebration. He wrote this:
I was in Washington on duty in the winter of 1864 and spring of 1865, was on the 7th Street Patrol on the night of April 14th, and as everything seemed so quiet, we took a shortcut to our quarters, passing down N Street, on which lived Secretary Stanton. About halfway between his house and the War Department, we met Secretary Stanton, and about 50 feet behind him were two men who crossed the street and went off in the dark instead of meeting the patrol guard. I have after thought those men were dogging the Secretary for no good, but meeting the guard were driven from following him. We passed into Jackson Square and stood looking at the White House with its many lights. On our left was Secretary Seward's residence. All at once an alarm of fire rang out on the air, and the fire engine at the corner by the War Department started up the avenue with a rush, and we broke ranks at once, some going to see the supposed fire and some going to camp in Washington Circle. We had scarce arrived there 5 blocks away ere a mounted orderly dashed into the camp and cried, fall in, President Lincoln is murdered at Ford's Theater." The long roll was beat. The men rushed out into the circle half-dressed, but carrying their rifles, into which they were ramming down the cartridges and with groans both fierce and deep, threatening dire vengeance on the murderers and declaring they would burn the theater to the ground. The officers got the men together as best they could, and forming a guard, at once marched to the theater, allowing no one to come near it. We were there told that as the president was sitting, his eyes fixed on the stage, someone came to the rear of the box in which sat the presidential party. Then all at once a pistol shot rang out, and the president fell forward. A man sprang out of the front of the box on the stage, catching his spur in the curtains as he did so. As he crossed the stage, he said, "Sic semper tyrannis," the motto of Virginia, meaning, "Thus be it ever to tyrants," also adding, "The South is avenged." The people saw it was John Wilkes Booth, and as he passed out the rear door, they turned to look at the president and saw he was shot in the back part of the head, and the lifeblood of the President of the United States dyed the theatrical robes of the actress, Laura Keene, on whose lap his head rested. The president died in the morning, and his body was conveyed to the White House and laid in the East Room, where I and many others saw him lay. Yes, there lay our martyred president in the hour that his armies had triumphed over the rebellious South, the man whose Emancipation Proclamation had freed 4 million slaves and made them free men and women, lay now before us in death, stricken down by the hand of an assassin.
George Sizer and Tamer Bates are my great-grandparents. So maybe that explains my fascination with the Civil War. Of course, Abraham Lincoln wasn't the only person who died during the war. There was, by many accounts, 620,000, maybe higher than that. Historians debate the number to this day. But where to put them all, where to bury them, especially those who are dying in Washington, D.C. Early in the war, Robert E. Lee, actually Mary Custis Lee, owned an estate, 11,000 acres, right across the river from Washington, D.C., in Arlington. Arlington House, a grand house. She had to flee and move to Richmond for the duration of the war. The Union Army occupied the land. And after a couple years, Quartermaster Montgomery Meigs said, that would be an ideal place to bury Union dead. And he was able to convince Stanton rather quickly to make that decision. And by 1864, they were starting to bury people there. And by 1865, the numbers were quite high.
Epilogue. On the Potomac's western heights in Virginia, on Robert Lee's land at Arlington, is the soldiers' last bivouac. Neat camps of green, and whitewashed wooden markers at attention compassed across the landscape in silent stand down. Sentries and surgeons, enlisted and officers, killed and survived, wounded and spared, combat and support, infantry and cavalry, artillery and supply, Army and Navy, East and West, white and colored, both blue and butternut, all answered the call. All invaulted underground, all mortal under God, all to be remembered, all so we remember.
Seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. He is trampling out the vintage where the grapes of wrath are stored. He has loosed the fateful lightning of his terrible swift sword. His truth is marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. His truth is marching on. Truth is marching. Truth is marching. I have seen him in the watchfires of 100 circling camps. They have builded him an altar in the evening dews and dams. I can read his righteous sentence by the dim and flaring lamps. His day is marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. His truth is marching on. In the beauty of the lilies, Christ was born across the sea, with the glory in his bosom that transfigures you and me. As he died to make men holy, let us live to make men free. While God is marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory,
The four sopranos, ladies and gentlemen. Please join us for refreshments. Whatever questions or comments you might have, you can take it up with us out there. Thank you very much for coming.